Today, Theresa May is set to meet with leaders from around the world at the UN General Assembly. Each of them has their own agenda, their own grievances dating back years, decades, or sometimes centuries. But does the United Nations actually serve any useful purpose any longer? Is it just a talking shop? Or perhaps the best example of what Winston Churchill meant when he said that jaw was better than war. Well, that is our talking point this morning, and here to talk it over are the foreign affairs experts, Tim Marshall and Mary Dejevsky. Lovely to see you both. Mary, to you first. I don't want us to kind of labour the history lesson for too long, but it's probably worth reflecting on the formation of the United Nations, the mess that it emerged from, and its stated purpose.
Yes, and I think the idealism that was behind establishing that, and the fact that it was sort of almost counter to what was deemed the failure of the League of Nations before. I think it started with an enormous amount of goodwill and pragmatism and idealism together. And we look at it now, all these years later, and there's enormous cynicism about it. But I have to say that I still retain more than a shred of belief in the United Nations, because it is unique. It's a unique assembly of so many countries that have a representation, and they have at least a forum, a small forum perhaps, to put their point of view. And I think that's still important.
Tim, still important? I mean, I suppose that the problem for the UN is that even people who don't follow international relations and foreign affairs as deeply as you two can very easily point to mistakes that the UN has made.
I can give you a list of mistakes and I would regard as moral issues, which are negative on behalf of the United Nations, as long as you're armed. But that still does not negate the fact that we need a UN, and if you didn't have one, you'd have to invent a new one. And talking shop is an interesting viewpoint, and yes, it is, but that's a good thing. I wrote a piece recently about UNGA, as it's called, United Nations General Assembly, in which I said, think of it in terms of the New York Fashion Week, which is also...
This is going to be an interesting analogy. I'm looking forward to this.
Stick with me. New York Fashion Week, which, by no coincidence, was also in New York, and was this month. What happens at New York Fashion Week is you see everybody up on the parade, parading up and down, showing off what they've got. And you do see across the next coming year some of what you saw on the fashion parade actually coming out on the street. So that analogy, I think, works for this week's UN. You see the leaders strutting their stuff, saying things which actually give you a guide to where they're going over the next year, and some great examples today. And then you see that playing out across the coming year. So in that sense, it is a very important week, and it's worth looking at.
Still, many people point to some very obvious hypocrisies that, whilst it was great and when it was set up, there was an awful lot of positivity around the United Nations. These days, we've got countries like Saudi Arabia lecturing the rest of the world on human rights.
But I think, you know, even the phrasing, the way you put it, talking about Saudi Arabia lecturing the rest of the world on human rights, that attitude, that it's possible to hold that and make that criticism, to have Saudi Arabia out there, it's exposed to that criticism simply by putting itself there.
But it's also legitimised, though, to the same extent by its position on, well, previously, for example, UN bodies dealing with human rights abuses. I mean, it is legitimised by having one of the commanding seats and one of the louder voices at the UN.
Yes, this is true, but it's one of the voices. It's not the only voice. And I think that's important in the sense that Saudi Arabia may have, as it were, a commanding position in its region, by virtue of its economy and its geography and everything else. But at the United Nations, it's one region among so many. So I think, you know, it's important. They put themselves out there and they can watch the reaction. And the reaction may be, indeed, you know, exactly as cynical as you've put it.
I slightly part company now from that view, because I think that simply points to the politics of the United Nations, and certain countries do try to capture certain parts of it, and it's all about the politics, and they use it. That example is a good one. When Libya was chaired the United Nations Human Rights Commission under Gaddafi, you simply use it to deflect any criticism from you. So that is one of the ones I had, but I'd rather give you some concrete examples, if I may, of why it is this week worth looking at. Trump will speak today. A, it's entertaining. B, he will come out with a massive list of proving what a fantastic bloke he is. But within that, there'll also be a direction of travel. Where's he going on the Palestinian issue? Is he going to withdraw the recognition of Palestinian refugees? They're the only people in the world whose sons and daughters remain refugees. Is he going to do that?
At the same time, though, Mary, isn't it a fairly damning indictment of the UN's track record that once again we are seeing not these big multilateral, multi-nation organisations like NATO and the UN being prime. It's the return of the nation state as the most important entity. Donald Trump, he's turning up to the United Nations, but I don't think we need to listen to him to know what his views are on international cooperation of that nature.
That's true. Trump hasn't exactly been backward about putting himself out there, has he? But I think that at the same time, Trump has, if not changed his position, the views that he puts and the issues that he singles out, those things, they're not the same from this year, from the next. And what we saw, it'll be very interesting to see how much is Donald Trump going to make of his initiative, and it was his initiative, for North Korea. Now, when you look at that with the benefit of the hindsight of the last 6 months, that has changed the whole climate in that part of Asia.
That's what I mean about the shop window and strutting your stuff, and then you see it come out across the year, and it's why it's worth watching today. Mrs. May, unfortunately for her, has got I think the last slot today, which is about
one where everyone clears out.
8:30.
Yeah.
Yes.
New York time is the middle of the night here, and even there, half the people have gone out to eat. David Attenborough is speaking today. There's a side meeting, and again, this is why it's concrete and useful. There's a side meeting. David Attenborough will champion partly what Sky is championing, and that is the plastic waste in the seas. So these forums, you need an umbrella organisation, and we've got one, and that's a positive
But I think
thing.
also, you mentioned the Palestinian issue, and that Donald Trump has put that back on the international agenda, and it absolutely needs to be there, because this is something that's been neglected at least over the last 20 years. And this is a colossal failure to point out that the UN Refugee Organisation that deals with the Palestinian issue, we are now into second, third, even fourth generations in refugee camps in the region. To highlight that and say that something must be done, even though it may be something completely
He's
wrong.
also withdrawing funding elsewhere, isn't he?
Yes,
Which
but to sort of attack it in a completely wrong-headed way, it's nonetheless on the agenda, and maybe it will be an impetus for people to look at the Palestinian issue again, and also not to repeat the mistakes that have been made with the Palestinians.
Very briefly, Tim, just to conclude, does it matter? Does it matter what I think about the United Nations if the United Nations actually does its job properly? Does it matter what the general public think if the UN is actually doing this work behind the scenes?
It matters in that it has to have legitimacy and support, and I think an awful lot of people do look at the work of the United Nations HCR, for example, for refugees, and realise that they save people's lives. And I think surely nearly everybody can agree we need a forum at the top to discuss things, because that's the only way. Otherwise, you've got two people at loggerheads, let's say Putin and Trump, shouting at each other. Let's get a bit of mediation in there.
I think also there is a colossal misunderstanding, in a way, that the United Nations can sort everything out, that it's a sort of supra-global organisation, and in fact it's just the sum of its members. And when there's dissension, then it's very difficult for it to act.
Indeed. Mary Dejevsky, Tim Marshall.
Thank you.
Lovely to see you both this morning. Thanks for joining us.